welcome to Actual Spinster. My name is Anna Marie, and today I'm going to do a hopefully fairly short April wrap-up because I only read 3 books in April. I guess I could talk a little bit about some of the books that I dipped into, maybe at the end, we'll see how I feel. And I did make a reading vlog where I read these books, but I didn't talk that much in depth about them, so hopefully this won't be boring if you've seen that and also want to watch this. So the first book that I finished in April was this, The Little Virtues by Natalia Ginzburg, translated by Dick Davis, and this is a collection of essays. It's split into 2 parts, but I don't really understand the kind of like thought behind that split up. I definitely enjoyed some of these, and some of them I didn't enjoy very much, and just like, yeah, they didn't interest me or provide anything particularly new to think about. My favourites were Winter in the Abruzzi, The Son of Man, which is like a staggeringly sort of intense, brilliant, awful essay to read about the destruction of World War II, and just absolutely impossible to read without thinking about the current genocide in Gaza and the rubble. It's very vivid and amazing, and honestly it could have been written about that. I mean, the contexts are very different obviously, and it talks in specificity about like Natalia Ginzburg's experience of the Second World War and Italian fascism, but especially at the beginning it's just like, yeah, truly one of the most incredible essays I've ever read, and one of those things that feels like very, once you've read it there's no unreading it. Like, My Vocation was also interesting because it's about Natalia Ginzburg's approach to her writing, which, having read, I think I've read now 4 or 5 of her work, and then this one maybe, or yeah, something like that. I do plan on making a video at the end of kind of like having read a couple more of her works to sum up and like talk about them all together, and maybe also do like a ranking and just talk about Ginzburg in general too. And in the context of reading through a lot of her work in quick succession, I definitely think My Vocation was interesting. She talks kind of about how she approaches writing, which is sort of to say, she's like, I'm not good at anything and I just know that like I have to write. But it doesn't feel like sort of, oh, I'm a genius at writing, And she also talks kind of quite a lot about character and how she's writing, that's sort of what inspires her character. And anyway, so yeah, I think like this is interesting if you're interested in Natalia Ginzburg and like what she's writing non-fiction wise, but I didn't find it especially kind of stand out, except from The Son of Man and Winter in the Abruzzi, which were both really amazing essays. The next book I read is in a book that I'm not going to get and pick up again because it's so heavy, but it's in my bind up of the Earthsea series or cycle by Ursula K. Le Guin. So I read the final book in that series, The Other Wind. I guess I can't really tell you what this book is about because it is like a final book that brings together a lot of storylines that are started, I mean, obviously in the very first one with Ged, and then also various other characters, especially Tanar, who's in the Tombs of Atuan, also Tahanu. I think it follows on fairly quickly after Tahanu, if I remember correctly, but unlike some of the other works that are like sort of in the series. So like there's the first 3 that were like, that's 4, the first 3 that were originally published, Wizard of Earthsea, Tombs of Atuan, and then The Farthest Shore. They were all published sort of like fairly quickly together, and then there's a long break, and then in the 90s I want to say Tahani was published, and that was also kind of seen as an end. And then Tales of Earthsea, I think is what it's called, is like a collection of stories, and some of them fit in chronologically after stuff, but there is a particular story that is the bridge between Tahanu and The Other Wind. There's a character specifically in it who shows up in The Other Wind. Yeah, so I can't really talk about that, but I did just find it like a really wonderful experience to read. I know I said this in my vlog, but it did transport me to my like childlike wonder and joy of reading again. I just felt it like, it just carried me off, it like just took me away, and I loved that. Yeah, I cried like so much. I actually like had a supervision just after I finished reading it, and I had just been like sobbing because it was like the ending, and it's about life and death in classic kind of Le Guinian style, and I was just like crying, and then I was like, no, I've got to like meet my supervisor to talk seriously about what's going on, so I gotta calm down. Yeah, I just really love it. So and then the last book I read last month was Family Lexicon by Natalia Ginzburg, translated by Jenny McPhee. Well, this is a novel, but it's also sort of a memoir. People talk about it as both. It's because Natalia Ginzburg kind of writes it as in the same vein as her novels, but it is about her family and her family life. I think it's a very interesting novel. There's definitely a part where I found it harder to get through, and I also personally feel like it's very interesting in the context of her own grief. Like, we just don't get, partially it's because she's writing it as a writer, in the sense that she's not writing it in a memoir as in like placing herself within events. It's much more about the other people around her, and there are things she says about herself and like her relationships, because she couldn't write this without doing that. But yeah, it's really not about her character at all, or her presence in the story. And as a result, and I wonder if she maybe wrote that in part as a response to her grief, especially about her husband, or her first husband, Leonie Ginzburg. There's also like just this like very sweet and tragic section she talks about Pavese and like his death, and how I think it was like his kind of sense of irony, like never, and like humorous irony, wasn't ever in any of his novels, and like that's just totally gone because of his death. I'm not doing a good job. So okay, let's start from the beginning. So this novel is, this book, Mari is calling me right now. So this book is about Natalia Ginzburg's family. They live in the city of Turin. Her dad is Jewish and her mum is like Catholic, although her mum isn't very religious or anything. And her dad is also like a scientist at a university, and they're both anti-fascist, and they were like Ginzburg and her brother, she's the youngest. She also has one sister actually. I think she has 3 brothers and 1 sister. I can't quite remember. And yeah, it's just like from her kind of like coming to awareness and her childhood into her adult life. Well, it's centered certainly on familial life and the way that like we create a kind of vocabulary with each other, hence the title Family Lexicon. There's a lot of sort of like, my mother used to say this because of this particular story, so whenever we had X she would say blah blah blah. Or there's like a line about apples where like Ginzburg's dad would be like, these aren't very good, and then her mom would say, but Peppino, they're carpanges. And like, you know, these sort of like phrases are like part of the evocation of memory, and the part of like getting to the core of somebody's like personality, potentially. The Levy family, which is Natalia Ginzburg's like family name, they were at the center of a lot of, I mean, I suppose they could have been more at the center. Like, they certainly weren't super militant, but they were anti-fascist in a time when it was getting increasingly harder to be. And of course they're also half Jewish or Jewish. Obviously it's complicated in terms of maybe how like Jews might identify or define Jewishness, but then fascists obviously define Jewishness in also a particular way. So maybe people who didn't have any like cultural or religious relationship to Judaism were still considered Jewish, and so therefore penalized by the like racial laws in Italy, and anti-Semitism and fascism, and targeted directly, some of whom were then organizing counter to the state and so forth. So yeah, it's just like, there was a lot in it, there was a lot to think about, and every now and again she's just like mentioning some random guy, but then it's like, oh, he was one of the like most sort of foundational people who started like Italian socialist parties, or you know what I mean, like just like very at the sort of center and crux of political organizing and development. There is also like a phrase in this that Natalia Ginzburg's father uses, and he does so I think right at the beginning of the novel, or the book, and I think in the afterward, or maybe it was just in the notes by Jenny McPhee, I would imagine, it sort of suggested that Natalia Ginzburg puts this front and center as a way to kind of further outline the foibles of her father, who is this like anti-fascist, who is this Jewish scientist, who nonetheless uses a particular phrase that is not nice in terms of race. He uses the phrase like Negroisms to denote like behaviors that he thinks are inappropriate or annoying. Like he says like, don't dribble, don't lick your plates, watch your manners, you know, behave at the table. If you were awkward, clumsy and faint-hearted, someone who dressed inappropriately, didn't know how to hike in the mountains, and couldn't speak foreign languages. So apparently there is a particular sort of terminology that comes from the Judeo-Italian language of Venetian Jews, which Ginzburg's father was raised, apparently, and where this is, this terminology means someone who's foolish, awkward, or stupid. Let me just read you the note, okay? Shaul Bassi, the director of the Venice Center for International Jewish Studies, claims that the words never have had overtly racial content. Ginzburg, however, was very aware of the word's racial significance, and her deliberate placement of these terms on the opening pages of her novel resonates throughout the book. I'm not sure if I agree that, like, I think Ginzburg did that, like, super purposefully. I think, obviously, there's a difference between how Ginzburg represented it and how we readers experience it, but I think whilst the complexities of her father and her whole family are very front and centre, I don't necessarily think she's ever at any point genuinely making like criticism, which I feel like she would need to be in order to be placing that particular phraseology right at the beginning of the book. I lost my sentence there, but did that make sense? Like, if she was so purposeful about where she placed this particular terminology, where she spoke to how her father used it and the meaning that he was trying to invoke with it, then I think throughout the book you would maybe get more sense that she's critical also of his other behaviours or of him using the terminology at all. Evidently it's incorrect that there's no racial kind of content within that phraseology. It's a racial term, it's a racialized term, and race within Jewish communities, especially sort of older ones in Europe, tend to be fairly complicated because of, well, a lot of things, but because of the legacies of like racial categorization and then internally the great diversity of Jewish racial traits, characteristics, experiences. As a result of that, there's also a lot of internal conflict within Jewish communities and identities about racialness, which I don't know enough to stake a claim about the Venetian Jewish community, but I would imagine that much like loads of other communities, there's anti-blackness and there's just like sort of colorism and that sort of thing. Yeah, I guess like I would definitely agree with like the person who wrote the notes to this that like it obviously does have a racial claim. I don't know how much I feel like Natalia Ginzburg was 100% trying to make a really deep choice about that. There's quite a lot in this book that feels sometimes very uncomfortable to read, and again, some of that I'm sure is on purpose, some of that is maybe me reading this now in the 2020s as opposed to 1970s, I think was when this was published, or, you know, 1963, my bad. And also obviously in the time frame that it's even depicting, which is like 40 years before then, and then to post Second World War. So yeah, anyway, that was like a long ramble. Hopefully I'll cut that down to make some sense. I did think it was really fascinating, very glad to have read it. Definitely interesting in terms of like Italian anti-fascism and the experience of Italian Jews. There's also this like such a funny bit which I read to I read to some Gentiles and they did not think it was funny, but I think it's so funny. There's this bit where, because Leonie Ginzburg was Jewish as well, and I'm not gonna be able to find it. There's this bit where like Giuseppe, like Natalia Ginzburg's father, says like oh, you know, Leonie, like Jews are ugly people, and then Lydia, like Natalia Ginzburg's mother, is like and you're not Jewish? And he's like, yes I am, and I am ugly too. And it's so funny. Yeah, it's a short book, but I do feel like it's full of so much. And obviously part of that is like Natalia Ginzburg's writing style is very succinct, but deep and to the point, and it feels very like evocative or vivid, even with such little words, you know, such little kind of, she doesn't use flowery language, she just gets straight to the point. I also listened to a really great podcast series, which I will link below, about Italian anti-fascism in the context, and like, although it's not like Ginzburg was mentioned or anything, I did find it interesting in terms of like contextualizing this book, and then also Ginzburg's like work too, and then also just Italy, like 20th century Italian history. I'll leave a link to that below. It's by Working Class History Podcast, like of course it is, because they're so good. Okay, I think that's like everything I'm gonna say, because I have gone on for a really long time. I'll maybe talk about other books at another time, but I mean, it was good to talk about this. Like, I would be really interested to hear your thoughts, and I'd also love to know if you have any other like reading suggestions for, yeah, Italian anti-fascist history, Italian Jewish anti-fascist history, just like Italian Jews in general, not just like located in the 20th century, but also earlier, or I guess later, but I am more interested like in historically. Yeah, I think that's everything, finally, again, and I will talk to you when I next talk to you. Bye!